Afternoon or evening. I mean, this is kind of a tough zone to describe properly. Thank you all for joining me. I want to just take a minute before we start to Lish'ol Shalom Yerushalayim, to pray for the peace of Jerusalem, to pray for wisdom and to rule the day in what is turning into a very dark and frightening moment. We are going to spend the next 4 afternoons doing a kind of literary and theological reading of the book of Ruth. By literary, I mean, this is an incredibly simplistic way of saying it, but by literary reading, I mean, I want to focus not just on what the book says, but on how the book says it. When I was in college, there was a textbook, which some of you have heard me mention before, which I remember nothing about other than its title. The textbook was called "How Does a Poem Mean?" as opposed to "What Does a Poem Mean?" And one of the things that I'm really interested in general in biblical studies is how do biblical texts mean? And so we'll pay attention to the literary dimensions of this text and the theological dimensions. What might this text say or imply? What might this text rather subtly say about God and about our relationship to God? And we'll kind of piece that together as we go. As always in my classes, we're going to try to work inductively rather than deductively. I'm using those terms rather loosely, but I'm going to read closely and build up from the text rather than offering grand theories and then look for proof texts to make their point. I also want to acknowledge that several people who have had major influences on my own understanding of this book are on this call. So with thanks to Judith Cates and Gail Reamer, I think Judy Fentress Williams might be on this call at some point. So welcome to you all. And I hope there's something of interest to you here as well. Can I have a volunteer to read the Hebrew and be mercilessly interrupted? And then Morty, you can start screen sharing, I think, if you're ready to do that. Anybody want to read? Otherwise, I'm going to call on Moshe Edelman. Oh, Barbara, is that your hand up? Morty, can you unmute Barbara Orville? If you can find Barbara.
Okay. In the days when the chieftains
Sorry, are you willing to read in Hebrew?
Oh, not quickly at all.
Okay. So let's forgive me. We're going to read in Hebrew and translate as we go. So, Moshe Edelman, are you willing to read? I can't find you, but I know I saw you before. No, I don't have Moshe. Wait. Grace. Oh, Moshe, I do have great Moshe now. Can we unmute Moshe? Okay, we're good. This is a slightly slowed beginning here. Hadassah, why don't you read? If not, I'm just going to start reading.
Am I unmuted?
Now you're unmuted. Okay, Moshe, go ahead.
Vayehi bimei shvot hashoftim, vayehi ra'av ba'aretz, vayelech ish mibeit lechem Yehuda, lagor b'stei Moav.
Okay, so in the days when the judges, or more likely the chiefs, ruled, there was a famine in the land, and a man from Bethlehem in Judah went to dwell temporarily. I'm translating lagur and the word of ger, to dwell temporarily in the land of Moab, in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. Now, I think it's important to say as we start out here that this book needs to be read at least in part against the background of the deep tension, and maybe we should say animosity, between Israel and Moab that is formulated even in biblical law. That is to say, that the prohibition on a Moabite marrying into the people of Israel. Okay? So the book needs to be read at least in part against that background, and it makes the decision of this family seemingly quite surprising. Okay, and it also seemingly makes Ruth's deep adherence and cleaving to Naomi quite striking. Okay, so now, what do we learn from this opening? First of all, Vayehi bimei. Now, this may be my overreading, but I wonder whether this phrase Vayehi bimei, in the days when, this is supposed to lead us to connect this book to the book of Esther. And as I will talk about as we go, I think there's a lot of extremely interesting theological connections between Esther and Ruth, and these texts talk to each other in, I think, quite rich ways. We'll get there. And the phrase Shavuot HaShoftim, one of the things that's interesting, and I don't know, I can't quite figure out whether this means as much as I think it might, is that in contrast to Ruth, the women in the book of Judges are often associated with violence, both as perpetrators and as victims. And it's striking the contrast that Ruth represents as this paragon of gentle love. There's something interesting going on there, even though I can't tell you exactly that I'm confident about what it is. This is probably, we're talking about roughly the 13th to the 12th century BCE, and it suggests an end of the time when Israel will be without a king, and anticipates that the monarchy will soon be established, as we'll see at the end of the book. Vayehi ra'av ba'aretz, and there was a famine in the land, I think is meant to remind us or call up the stories of Abraham and Sarai and Isaac and Rebekah. And the question is, of course, what does the connection between this story and those suggest? The connection to Abraham is not just famine, it's also childlessness, which is a crucial piece, right? There's a way in which this story mirrors the Abraham story in some very important and fundamental way. And the parallel may also suggest that despite whatever deep crises are going to take place here, whatever deep sorrows will be experienced, joy will eventually emerge. That somehow, perhaps, the phrase Vayehi ra'av ba'aretz already telegraphs the possibility that transformation will take place in this story. Now, the interesting question, I think, theologically, and this kind of gets the midrash going, is in this story, it would seem that famine simply serves to get the events going. It sets events in motion. And yet, in other texts, like in Deuteronomy chapter 11, famine is connected with punishment. And that leads the Targum and the midrash to immediately speculate about which sins prompted the famine in question. You could see Rashi talking about Elimelech's stinginess. Why does a wealthy man run away during a famine rather than sharing his largesse, right? But I think that you can also add, I don't know if Judy Fentress Williams is on this call, but in her commentary on Ruth, she points out that in the time of Judges, in the book of Judges, you have this pattern of sin followed by punishment, right? And that raises the question, at least, of whether this famine is somehow to be seen as a punishment for the people's sins. But at minimum, we can say the text does not say that, does not make it clear at all, okay? Now, we're not going to spend as much time as I'm spending on the first verse on every verse, I promise. But Beit Lechem. So Beit Lechem is the Canaanite term for the house of Lachmu, of the god Lachmu. However, to the Hebrew speaker, it would sound like the house of bread, which obviously is quite ironic. Famine prompts this family to leave the house of bread, okay? And when it says Ishmi Beit Lechem, which I think JPS translates a certain man, no, it translates as a man of Bethlehem. This may well suggest that this is supposed to be someone from a well-established Bethlehem family. And that, if that's right, suggests that this famine was quite severe, because the stronger your ties to a place, the more reluctant you are to leave. Witness all kinds of events of American history in the last few years, people from New Orleans who don't want to leave, right? So there's some way in which the deeper the tie of Elimelech to Beit Lechem, the more surprising perhaps the departure, and therefore by implication, the deeper and more intense the famine. One of the things that Parshanim, traditional commentators, do is kind of, they find themselves preoccupied with the question of, did Elimelech do anything wrong by leaving, right? As I've already implied, some rabbinic midrashim fault him for abandoning the community. You could see Ruth Rabbah 1:4, but I don't think there's any clear hint of that in the pshat, in the straightforward reading of this text. And then, of course, as I already indicated, going of all places to Moab. either this famine is really, really bad, or this family has very poor judgment, right? You think about Lot going to Sodom as a failure of judgment on his part, potentially. One wonders what's going on here. Is it just things are so dire that you don't ask questions, you go where you can go? Or is it that there's a criticism here? Okay, and you can see how midrash works with the biblical text, right? There's all kinds of things that we could read one way or the other already in the first verse, and the midrash will play around with that and open up possibilities. Okay, pasuk bet.
V'shem ha'ish Elimelech, v'shem ishto Naomi, v'shem shnei banav Machlon v'Chilion, Ephratim mi Beit Lechem Yehuda, v'yavo sdei Moav v'yiyu sham.
Great. Okay, so we'll read. The man's name was Elimelech. His wife's name was Naomi, and the names of his two sons were Machlon and Chilion. They were Ephratites from the Beit Lechem area in Judah. If you even today, contemporary Ephrat is right next to Beit Lechem. They come to the country of Moab. They came to the country of Moab and remained there. JPS translates. So let's just say a couple things about this verse. First of all, the separation of actions from names is a way of helping us focus on the names, some of which have symbolic meanings. In other words, in verse 1, we already heard about the actions. And then in verse 2, we're going to stop and hear about the names, which allows us to pause and reflect upon them. That's a kind of literary device. Now, Elimelech's main role is to be absent, right, in this story. His role is essentially in the story is to die and disappear. And yet one wonders what his being named Elimelech is meant to suggest to the reader. There's a pious reading according to which his name is a kind of reminder that there is another source of protection that is still active here. That's, for example, how the Bible scholar Ellen Davis reads this. I'm not sure what it means. I wonder whether part of this is a way of saying this might be connected to the period of the judges. There is no king in Israel, but there is a king of Israel, and that is God. I'm not totally sure. I'm open. People want to share thoughts about that in the comments. I think there is something interesting there. A Bible scholar named Daniel Hawk makes the observation that it is ironic for a man living at a time when there was, quote, no king in Israel and everyone did as they saw fit, as the language of Shoftim says, right, that is in fact his name. The question that I think is worth thinking about, and we're going to stumble upon this question repeatedly in the book, is that there's a certain kind of reading of this text that's especially common among conservative evangelical scholars that says one of the lessons in this book is that even though it doesn't seem that way, God is totally in control and everything is ultimately orchestrated according to the will of God. I happen to find that to be an extremely unsubtle reading and not very persuasive. I think there's something much more subtle going on in this book, which is about, if anything, the dependence of God on human chesed, which we'll talk about as we go. But so a conservative evangelical reader will love the fact that Elimelech has the name Elimelech, because look, at the very opening of the book, you have this declaration that God is king and God is in charge. I must say I don't buy it, but smarter people than I have said it, so I want to mention it. Now, the names of the sons, Machlon and Chilion, are really interesting because, as Yair Zakovich points out, the names are from bad to worse. Illness and then death. Machlon, Machala, Chilion, dying. This is parallel, by the way, to those who are focused on the book of Genesis, to the names Er and Onan. Er from the word Ariri, childless, and Onan from the word Onain, for one who is in mourning or has suffered a loss. Right? You have these names that are bad to worse. Now, why it tells us they're from Ephrat? There's actually a bunch of different approaches in the scholarship on this. I'll just mention one that strikes me as the most plausible contextually, which is that this is an allusion to David, who is called the son of an Ephratite, and it is where he is first anointed. These are passages in Shmuel Aleph. It is also imagined, Ephrat, as the place where the future Davidic ruler will come from. That's Micha Perek Hey Pasuk Aleph, Micah 5:1. Okay? Now, Vayiyu Sham, JPS I mentioned translates, they remain there. Ellen Davis translates in a way that I think is really interesting, and there they were. vayiyusham, and there they were. She translates this as suggesting a sense of foreboding already in this verse. Since Moab represents, in the ancient Israelite mind, a place of perversion and godlessness, then this is not the most promising place for a story for an Israelite family to unfold. That's her really interesting rendering, I think, of Vayiyusham. Okay, Pasuk Gimel. We are flying here. Okay, Moshe. Okay, so Vayamot Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her two sons. Here again, by the way, you have a simple report in the narrative that Elimelech died, and later interpretations will build a narrative about how he was punished for deserting his people. That's Ruth Rabbah 1:5. Now it's striking, and it's worth noticing here. Vayamot Elimelech ish Naomi. Elimelech is now, in an interesting way, from a gendered perspective, understood as his role is to be the husband of Naomi. He is now identified in relation to her, which suggests, I think, that she has now stepped into the role of prime character in the story. She's the hero of the story, if you will, and he has been relegated to a side character. Shnei Vaneha is a way, I think, of underscoring her mourning. Notice that in verse 1, what did we have in verse 1? It said, Hu ve'ishto u'shnei vanav, and now it's Shnei vaneha. She is alone. It kind of is an underscoring of her desolation. Okay, Pasuk Daled, verse 4.
Vayisu lahem nashim Moabiyot, shem ha'achat Arpa, v'shem ha'shenit Ruth, v'yeshvu sham ke'ester shanim.
Okay, so then they married Moabite women. One was named Orpah and the other was named Ruth, and they lived there for about 10 years. Now, marriage to Moabite women, in light of Deuteronomy 23, which if you're not familiar with, you might want to take a look at, marriage to Moabite women would seem to be, it seems to be rather striking that the narrator has no judgment about this, or seems to have no judgment about this, since after all, marrying Moabites would appear to be prohibited by the Bible. We'll see that in some ways Rabbinic midrash, partially animated by this story, will say, no, that's about Moabite men, not about Moabite women. But that seems to me probably a post facto reading of this narrative. And already the Targum, the earliest layers of Jewish interpretation, labels the action of marrying Moabite women a sin. Ellen Davis refers to this, and I'm going to quote her for a minute, as a public scandal of major proportions. I have to say, I really wonder. I wonder whether Bidafka, specifically, this text does not want to say that, and thereby maybe registering some kind of disagreement quietly with that prohibition on marrying a Moabite. I'm not really sure. It seems like in any case, this might be happening quietly and under the radar. Okay, so just so you know, medieval commentaries are quick to say, Radak and Ibn Ezra, for example, oh no, of course they converted the women first. But that, of course, is, that's not in the narrative. Chazal, as I just mentioned, the sages of the Talmud talk about how the prohibition was only on Moabite men. And yet, for whatever it's worth, there are other voices in the rabbinic tradition that say, no, of course they weren't converted. Rabbi Meir and Ruth Rabbah, for example, points that out. It is striking, I think, that the narrative does not offer us a judgment and perhaps invites the reader, as she is listening to this text, to make her own judgment about whether there is any causal link between the actions taken by these young men and the events that ensue. Right? Do they die because they did this? Is this a punishment or something else? Okay. I just want to say something quickly about their names. Orpah would seem to conjure up oreth, meaning back of the neck, seemingly perhaps suggesting someone who eventually will walk away from Naomi and not be seen by her. You can read that as highly negative, as the midrash does, or you could read it as not negative at all. That's, I think, worth asking about. We'll come back to that and discuss that in a minute. The name Ruth may derive from the Hebrew root resh vav hey, meaning moist, overflowing with moisture, something like that. Ellen Davis, who I've mentioned a few times already, makes the interesting observation that the fact that of all these names, Ruth is the one that is hardest to derive, to come up with a clear derivation of her name, maybe the narrator's way of pointing to the complexity of her character and the irreducibility of her to one particular character trait or image. She's much livelier and more richly textured than that. I think that that's an interesting possibility. Tikva Freimer-Kensky, may she rest in peace, when she was writing her commentary on Ruth before she died, she tried to connect the name Ruth to a cloud, so that Oref and Rochev Ba'aravot would be Orpah, and Ruth was a name. They're both different names of different kinds of clouds. I'm not sure if that's not Darshanut, but anyway, okay, that's what we have so far. Now, 10 years appears to be an allusion to Genesis 16, the story of Avraham, Sarai, and Hagar, the suggestion that the couples were childless, which is not otherwise explicitly stated. I guess one could say that this means that they were married for 10 years or that Elimelech had just moved there 10 years ago. But it seems to me more likely that it means they were married 10 years and therefore there was a childless marriage. And that's what's going to animate what unfolds next. Okay. Pasuk Hey. Moshe, you ready?
Yeah. וימותו גם שניהם מחלון וכיליון, ותישאר האישה משני ילדיה ומאישה.
Umeisha. Great. So they too died, Machlon and Kilion, and the woman was left. I don't even know how the best rendering of that would be. She was left bereft of her two. I want to translate not sons, but I want to translate children. Yiladeha, which I think is actually important. She was left bereft of her children, and without her husband. So, first of all, here again, at the risk of really belaboring this, nothing in the text itself seems to suggest any kind of punishment here. And again, the Targum jumps in and says, well, how could it be anything but a punishment? They married Moabite women, didn't they? But I think, again, that may be a retrojection of a set of assumptions that this text does not necessarily share. Now, she was left without her sons, poignantly connects to verse 3. I think it's really important to catch the literary texture of this story. In verse 3, she was left vatishaer hi ushne vaneha. She was left with her two sons. They are the loss of her husband. And here, right, vatishaer haisha mishne vaneha. She was bereft of her sons too. I think that that's actually quite poignant. Now, the repetition of vatishaer can be read, I think, to reinforce just how much she has lost. One modern Israeli scholar suggests that we should read vatishaer in the opposite way, which is that it's a way of pointing out, of directing our attention away from what has been lost to what is still there and therefore possible. I would be inclined to read the first reading because I think this narrative is extremely interested in evoking rather than describing Naomi's desolation. Ha'isha is interesting. Here, I want to quote someone in the volume, Judith Cates, that you edited, Lois Dubin's really interesting comment about how she's called Ha'isha here because the narrator almost can't bring himself to say the name Naomi because it so doesn't fit the story at this moment. Naomi meaning pleasant one, meaning one who is perhaps even delighted. That in this moment, when you're describing her utter desolation, she's now lost not only her husband, but her kids. You don't call her Naomi, you just call her the woman. Yiladeha, I underscored that before. I think it misses the valence of this pasuk to translate as JPS does, her sons. Because Yiladim usually in biblical Hebrew actually refers to little kids, but these were grown-ups who were married. So I think this is intended to be a subtle, or perhaps not even so subtle, evocation of the depth of her grief, right? Now, it's possible, like some scholars say, no, Yiladea really is a way of saying that from a genealogical perspective, they remain children because they don't have children of their own. And that might be, but it seems to me that in the flow of the story, what is going on here is that you know, any mother who buries a child is burying a child, even if the child is, 50 or 70 years old. and it, as I think, Judith, as you point out in your essay on this, right? There's a way in which they always remain for her what they fundamentally are. They are her children, and that's the loss that the text asks us to confront. Now, here, just notice, this is a great example of how biblical artistry, narrative artistry works, right? There are no emotion words here. What there is simply a set of literary cues that can almost make you choke as you read them, because you feel the intensity of her loss without the narrator using those words. This is that famous essay by Eric Auerbach, Odysseus' Scar, if I remember correctly, right? That in a Greek story, you'll have like this incredible profusion of feelings. In the biblical story, think of the Akedah as another great example of this, right? No emotion words. That's the reader's work. Okay. Okay. Now let's push forward a little bit to pasuk vav. Go ahead, Moshe.
ותקם היא וכלותיה ותשב משדה מואב, כי שמע בשדה מואב, כי פחד השם את עמו לתת להם לחם.
Okay, so she started out with her daughters to return from Moab, because in Moab she had heard that Hashem had taken note of Hashem's people and given them food. So first, I want to mention something that is perhaps completely obvious, but in all the times that I have worked through this text, I never thought about this until this week when I've been reading Judy Fentress Williams' commentary on Ruth, that this verse and the ones that come after it seem to imply that at first Naomi was fine with her daughters-in-law going back with her, and that verse 8 then represents something of a change of heart. I have to say, I hadn't really thought about that way before. But that, at first they start out and they're going together. And then there's this moment where she says, wait a minute, I can't bring you back with me. And we'll talk about why she might think that in just a minute. Okay. Now, vatakom is worth saying. Vatakom hi v'chalotea. Vatakom, and she got up, is a singular verb, which is always a way of emphasizing which character is the main subject of the verb. Vatidaber Miriam ve'Aaron b'Moshe. I have something like that in the book of Numbers, right? So that's what leads perhaps to the reading that Miriam is the one who is the leader in that situation. So vatakom, she is the main character. The singular verb seems to keep her in the foreground. Kaloteha, I think, is also an enormously tragic word. JPS translates daughters-in-law. I would be inclined to translate Kaloteha here as her bride daughters or something like that. Her brides, because Kala is not just a daughter-in-law, it's also a bride, which evokes all the things that have been lost in this story: joy, love, possibility, etc. All of what's been lost here. I mean, love has not been lost, but Naomi doesn't really understand that yet. Okay, these brides are widows, and that's the power. Now, Kifakad Hashem. I just want you to see something really interesting, again, about the artistry. This is where the literary and the theological come together. The narrator does not tell us that God had remembered God's people. The narrator reports a rumor that God had remembered God's people. And that is interesting, right? To this question of the theology of this text, right? The narrator says that Naomi had heard. It's actually a rumor about a rumor, if you will. Right? This is the definition of a non-omniscient narrator in a way, right? That there's a way in which she knows, she hears that God has remembered God's people. Is God involved? Well, that's the rumor. That's a really interesting theological move, a way of introducing God in a halfway kind of way. Okay. Now, Yair Zakovich is a professor of Bible at the Hebrew University and really interested in sort of literary modes of reading. He makes the claim in one of his essays, probably more than that, but in one of his essays I'm thinking of, that as a rule, biblical narratives do not try to relate. If they can, they will avoid relating suffering to God and instead mention no reason for the suffering, and then introduce God as in an allusion to the grace of God that puts an end to the distress. I mean, there are exceptions to that, and I'm not totally sure that that's right, but it's an interesting observation. In other words, that God is introduced here in ending the famine, but was not introduced in bringing the famine in the first place. Worth thinking about, okay? So also worth saying here is that what we're encountering is two disasters that are intertwined with one another, a national disaster and a familial disaster. And so the thing that I think verse 6 would cause us to ask is, the national disaster appears, so we hear, so the rumor says, to be coming to an end. So what will become of the familial disaster? Will that one end too? Will the personal disaster come to an end as the familial one? The chances seem small at this point, but the reader is kind of pulled in to keep reading to find out what will happen. It kind of, we are propelled forward into the story. Okay, Pasuk Zayin.
ותצא מן המקום אשר הייתה שמה, ושתי כלותיה עמה, ותלכנה בדרך לשוב אל ארץ יהודה.
Okay, so here I don't want to say much. Accompanied by her two daughters-in-law, she left the place where she had been, and her two bride daughters were with her, and they went along the way to return to the land of Judah. Now, just notice the contrast, just so we see how powerful the contrast is between Vayelech in chapter 1, verse 1, Vayelech Elimelech, the kind of like, right, versus Vateitzei of Naomi with nothing. He leaves with a whole family. She returns with totally nothing. Now, I'm embarrassed to say that I don't really have a theory about this that I like, but it is striking that lashuv, that root, is a major preoccupation of this chapter. It appears at least 12 times in this chapter by my counting, but it still requires some unpacking to me about exactly what exactly what work it's really doing. I'm not sure I quite yet have a full read on. And again, feel free to add your thoughts about that. Morty, you'll say, if you don't mind, please save the comments at the end so I can also read them later. Okay, so now Pasuk Chet. This is where the story begins to get complex. Okay, go ahead.
ותאמר נעמי לשתי כלותיה, לכנה שובנה אישה לבית אמה. יעש אדוני עמכם חסד כאשר עשיתם עם המתים ועמדי. Okay, so Naomi said to her two bride daughters, I'm maybe belaboring that translation, but I do think it's helpful. Go and return, there's that shovna again, each woman to the house of her mother, and may God do chesed with you, may God do kindness, faithfulness with you, as you have done with the dead and with me. So here first, I want to just observe that her words would seem to suggest that what animates her is concern for their own welfare, right? She desires to release them from any obligations to her. And it's striking. Robert Alter, I don't know if he's the first person to say this or not, but Robert Alter kind of made famous the idea that the first thing a character says is a significant window into what you should know about them. And here, it's striking that the first thing she says, despite what we'll see in a minute, is deeply attentive to their welfare. I emphasize this because there are some scholars who argue that Naomi is quite cynical here and out for her own self-protection. That feels to me to be like a not compelling reading of what's happening here. If anything, what strikes me that the narrator is interested in here is the sheer emotional shatteredness of this character. And we'll see that as we go. The way I might put this is Naomi feels alone, so she wants to be alone. She tries to create a scenario. And you can imagine people in your life who you've seen do that at different times of their life. Okay, so she, by the way, I love the fact that my daughter is posting comments on this chat. Isn't that just so exciting? Sorry, of course, I lost my train after saying that. I totally lost it. So I'm going to just pick up where I was. Another strand of interpretation is that she is fundamentally ashamed to bring them back with her. You see that in midrash Ruth Zuta. You see that in some modern commentaries, that she's embarrassed to bring Moabite women home with her.
I also feel, first of all, I'm not sure it's convincing, but second of all, I think her repeated use of the word bnotai, my daughters, seems to militate against that reading. And if anything, as my daughter Maya, who was 6 when she said this to me, pointed out, maybe she actually wants to protect them from coming to a place where they will obviously be greeted with hostility, right? You don't, it's not always the wisest move for your Moabite friend to say, come, let's hang out in Bethlehem, right? Moabites are the target of great animosity, okay? Now, it's also possible, as Tamar Eskenazi points out in her commentary on Ruth, which I think is almost always an impulse we should consider, that mixed motives may be in play, right? That in fact, Naomi may be more than a one-dimensional character. She may have their interests and her interests in mind. She may be devastated and wanting to be alone, and she may also be nervous about what it will mean to bring them home. In other words, we should be careful about when you interpret the motives of a character, a human character or just a literary character, right? To assume that it must be one or the other. Okay, so I think that that's important. Another possibility that I'll mention, which I do not buy, but I just want to just share and mention this possibility, is that a Bible scholar named Kristen Nielsen has tried to argue that she feels incredible anxiety around them because she wonders whether they are in some way responsible for the death of her sons, and having them around her is just very painful for her. Perhaps Moabite women are somehow dangerous to Israelites. I have to say, in a deeply scholarly mode, I just don't buy it. This doesn't seem right to me. Okay, so for whatever it's worth, seems to me more likely that she wants to protect them. So now, going on, Judy Fentress Williams makes a nice observation that this is a literal turning point. That is to say, they are at a crossroads and must choose a path. That is literally and figuratively true. They have to decide, are they going home or are they going to the land of Israel? And so the crossroad is both literal and metaphorical. The symbol is almost a little heavy-handed. Fentress Williams also makes another comment that I have to say I never really thought about, and I think it's a really interesting feminist reading of this text, which I haven't seen anyone else quite say, which is that this scene can be read as Naomi giving Ruth and Orpah an opportunity to choose their own identity. And this is a gift to a woman that would be extremely rare in a culture like this, right? Whether a widow was supposed to stay or go, there would have been cultural expectations around that. But Naomi's command offers them a certain kind of self-determination. What do you want to do? You can come with me, but you can also go. And there's a way in which they then end up with a choice to determine their own future in some important way. I think that that's quite striking and interesting. Now, in what follows, it's interesting that Naomi refers to herself obsessively. In verses 8 to 13, she mentions herself at least 11 times, which is really striking. And what I want to just suggest that that's about is not an attempt to paint her as a narcissist, which is what the flat reading of Ruth would do, but actually as a way of thinking about how it is that depression and desolation close us in on ourselves and make it very hard for us to see much beyond our own suffering. And there's a way in which I think it's an enormously poignant portrayal of the amount of pain that she finds herself in this story. Now, to just belabor verse 8 for a minute, Vatomer Naomi lishtei chalotea, she said to her 2 daughters-in-law. Why the word 2? Why not to her daughters-in-law? Right? Why that? And I think here that what you have is, on the one hand, you can say that they were of one mind at this point, the 2 were like one. But on the other hand, it might be a way of saying there's only 2 of them left. Look how big this family was, and now it's only 2 people that she's left with. I'm not sure. I mean, I'm not sure. That word is superfluous, and so I wonder what it actually is meant to do. It's also striking about this verse, and I realize that it is now 5:46, which is not a great pacing on my part, that she talks about each one of them going back to the house of their mother and not to the house of their father. The term Beit Ima appears in two other places, if I'm not mistaken, in Tanakh, both related to strong women. Rebecca runs to report the arrival of Abraham's servant to her mother, and the woman in Song of Songs takes her beloved into her mother's house. What I suspect this means is that where marriage is concerned, young women turn to their mother's house. That somehow there's a special role that the mother plays in marital arrangements. Here's Zakovich in a rather interesting comment that says, let's not make too much of this. Women who are trying to struggle with whether or not to get married and who to marry go talk to their moms more than their dads. Maybe. Okay. I have not done an empirical study of this, and I wonder if he has either. Okay. One of the things that is worth mentioning, I think, is that implicitly she is telling them that she herself cannot function as their mother, right? And that's important because that perception will change as the story goes, right? Each one of you should go back to her mother, meaning I'm not your mother. And yet, lo and behold, as the story unfolds, she is precisely that to Ruth in some way, I think, okay? Rachel Adler makes the nice comment here that when she says, Yas Hashem imachem, may God do for you as you have done, that blessings and chesed are the only two things that the destitute can bestow. It's a comment she makes in Engendering Judaism. When you have nothing, all you can do is bless and be kind. That there's a way in which I think it's kind of a lovely observation about this. It's also interesting theologically, to me at least, that Naomi seems to have no doubt that chesed is something for which Hashem rewards all people and not just Israel. Right? I mean, that to most people on this call, that's like, okay, well, that's obvious. I'm not sure that was totally obvious in a biblical world. So I think that that's interesting and worth mentioning. I want to just observe about chesed im hametim, love or kindness for the dead. The midrash seems to think that the midrash raises the possibility that that refers to how they treated their husbands after they died. And ends up taking this as an example of what Chazal, the sages, referred to as chesed shel emet, right? That is true chesed, which is how you treat someone dead because you cannot be recompensed by them. It is pure kindness without any, by definitionally, without thought of being rewarded. I suspect that the simple meaning of this is it refers to the chesed that they showed them in life before they died. But nevertheless, I think that midrash is beautiful and worth knowing about. Zakovich makes the beautiful observation that she refers to them as hametim, the dead, rather than as yiladai or banai, in order to try to keep a lid on the intensity of her emotion and that feeling. That is the only thing she can bring herself to say. She has to distance from them in order to express. This is all about, to return to something many of you have heard me say many times, the art of reading Tanakh is all about however slowly you read by nature, you must train yourself to read more slowly, right? There is nothing worse for a biblical text than trying to skim. So I want to just mention here that there's something about reading slowly here. Then you notice, oh, why doesn't she say banai? Why does she say the dead? Then you wonder, like, how does that create some safety so she can actually get the words out? Okay. Zakovich also makes the really interesting comment. If chesed means, and one of the things I'm avoiding, at least for this class, is trying to talk about the biblical meaning of the word chesed, or I should say the biblical meanings of the word chesed, is that if one of the meanings of chesed is doing more than you are technically required to do, which I'm not completely sure is what it means in the Bible, but it may be one of the meanings, Zakovich points out that by telling them they did chesed, she is trying to assuage their guilt about leaving her, meaning you already did more for me than you had to. So it's okay if you go. I think that that's actually quite beautiful. Okay. Now, also just notice that in this story, the cycle of chesed is begun by Moabite women. I think one thing we can say is the author of this story was not a xenophobe. I mean, it's a funny way to put it, but there's something very interesting going on here. Again, against the background of the animosity between Israel and Moab. And if you're interested in this kind of thing, I also think there's a totally breathtaking moment in chapter 2 when Boaz gives Ruth water, repairing how Moab treated Israel by refusing them water. And Moab says, here, come drink as much as you want, take from my own dishes. There's something really interesting going on there. Okay. Rather than revenge, there's a kind of modeling of a certain kind of generosity. Okay. Now I'm gonna Moshe, forgive me, I'm gonna take over for a minute. Yitain Hashem lachem, she says, umitzaena menucha. May God grant that you find peace or security. Isha beit isha, a woman, each of you in her husband's home. Vatishak lahen, and she kissed them. Vatisena kolan, vativkena, and they raised their voices and they cried. Now, just to telegraph what I want to talk about in a couple of days, what is so striking is that here she says, may the Lord grant you security. And in chapter 3, we're going to see that it is in fact she who goes and seeks to achieve security for them. And there is something very important, I think, theologically going on there about how blessing in the world works and what divine providence does and doesn't mean, and the ways that humans, in what I would, my language here, enacting the presence of God rather than simply waiting for it. Now, menucha, I just want to make sure that people are aware that menucha is about a kind of security in the presence of God. Yanchini b'maglei tzedek, may God keep me safe and secure. So here she is giving them a kind of blessing of God's favor and God's presence with them. Now, the only reason I hesitate about saying that is I'm not sure if that's what she means. That let me put it differently. I'm not sure I can defend that that's what she means, given how alienated from God she appears to be at this moment. But that is what I think menucha, at least on first reading, would conjure for us. Okay, and then here I want to notice something really interesting about the translation. Okay, vatishak lahen, and she kissed them, and the translation, JPS does something uncharacteristic. Instead of translating and she kissed them, JPS inserts this interpretive word, and she kissed them farewell. Now you might say that's harmless, but I would like to just point out that kissing while crying in the Bible is sometimes about saying goodbye and sometimes about saying hello. That is to say, when Yaakov and Esav meet, there is a crying and kissing. When Yosef and his brothers, when it's now out in the open who each one of them is, there's a kissing and crying. On the other hand, there's Lavan and his daughters, where there's a crying and leaving. And I wonder whether the literary artistry of this text is to suggest, I know it seems like she's kissing them farewell, but really, she's kissing them hello, because she's about to have them in her life in a whole different way. So I think, I would just sort of caution the JPS translators about seemingly harmless interpretive interpolations. I think that that's not great, actually. I realized that the JPS translators knew what they were doing, but still. Okay. Now, by the way, Vatisena kolan vativkena is not totally clear to me whether that means that all three of them cried or whether the two daughters cried in response to her kissing them. But in any case, in other words, they get that she's trying to push them away, and they cry in protest and sadness. Okay, and then they respond to her. I just happened to see a comment. You ready for my translation to be published? I don't have the linguistic skills for that, but thank you. Vatomar nala, and they said to her, Ki itach nashuv le'amech. No, we will return to you with your people. Eskenazi, I think nicely here, translates, it is with you that we return to your people. Right? Because the thing that comes first is the emphasis. In other words, JPS would work better if it said, Ki nashuv itach le'amech, but ki itach nashuv, it is with you that we shall return. Our loyalty is to you. Now, why do they want to stick to her? As is so common in biblical narratives, there's no description of her feelings. We are left as readers to do the work. Now, Some interpreters, as I've already implied, criticize Naomi for refusing to keep caring for her daughters-in-law. But Tikva Freimer-Kensky here, I think, was really, really astute, where she basically says, in this ancient society, it is adult sons and daughters who care for aging parents or for a widow, not the other way around. And therefore, rather than releasing herself from obligations to them, Naomi is releasing them from obligations to her. And yet, as Ashkenazi points out, we might say motives can be complicated. All of us know what it's like to do something for the right reason and also for the not totally right reason, or to be generous and also not so generous. But I think that that's an important, powerful reading. There's a way in which she's quite, she is liberating them, and they say, no, we don't want to be liberated. Lo, okay? Now, for whatever it's worth, there are scholars who amend this verse or who insert the word lo, that is to say, vatomarna la, and they said to her, lo, comma, ki itach nashuv la'amech. You can imagine how the la and the lo turn into one word, or even simply vatomarna lo, ki itach nashuv la'amech. All of those are possible. In other words, we're not going, okay? And there's something, it's just worth stopping to observe that nashuv is a really interesting thing for them to say, given they're going someplace they've never been. We will return with you to the land of Israel where we have never been before. I think that that's something about how utterly attached to her they are, but it's interesting. I'm going to do a couple more verses and stop for a few questions, and we'll pick up in the middle of chapter 1 tomorrow, and we'll count on verse 4 being chapter 4 being shorter. And then again, she reiterates, Vatomer Naomi, Shov navnotai, go back, my daughters, or turn back, my daughters. Lama teilach naimi, why should you go with me? Ha'odli banim b'me'ai, do I have more sons in my body, in my belly? V'hayu lachem la'anashim who you shall marry. And then we'll read one more verse. I'm going to talk about them together. Shov navnotai, lechna. Turn back, my daughters, go. Ki zakanti niyot leish. I am too old to be with a man. Ki amarti yesh li tikva. Gam hayiti alayla leish v'gam yaladati banim. Morty, scroll, please. You still there? Okay. I am too old to be married. And even if I thought it was a possibility, even if I got married tonight and I had sons, halahen tesaberna, you're going to wait for them? Adasher yigdalu, and then you'll marry them. Halahen te'agena, are you going to anchor yourselves to them? Livilti hayol ish, and not be with a man for your entire adult life? Albinotai, don't do this, my daughters. Kimarli me'od mikem, incredibly, wonderfully ambiguous phrase, which we'll talk about in just a minute. Ki yatzavi yad Hashem, because the hand of the Lord has struck out against me. So, first of all, benotai, I just want to notice in both of these verses, 11 and 12. Morty, go back up so people can see 11 and 12, if you don't mind. Thank you. They are growing closer, even as they argue about what to do, right? They are now banot rather than kalot. They are daughters rather than merely daughter brides. Or actually, it might be Leah scrolling. Sorry, I didn't mean to ignore you. Here's a really interesting comment that Tamar Ashkenazi makes about which is also an interesting feminist reading of the story. Naomi's rhetorical questions reveal that in her mind, the desire to find a husband should be the only thing to motivate women who find themselves in this situation. But that attitude is directly subverted and undermined by what then unfolds, with this Ruth decides to act based on her love for Naomi, not her need for a husband. That is a subversion of all kinds of cultural expectations and assumptions in a way that I think is quite interesting and rich. Okay? Note also, by the way, what she does not say, which is that perhaps she thinks it's unfathomable that they will be able to meet husbands in Judah, given that they're Moabites. Right? That's not even on the, as we say in Yeshivish, that's not even in the Parsha. Right? There's no possibility in her mind that could be what unfolds. I'll just mention this here, and we'll get to it later. Not that I or anyone else has totally great wisdom about this. It does seem that the way she tells the story here suggests that the laws of Yibum, of levirate marriage, can fall upon brothers from the same mother but a different father. that is not the impression that Deuteronomy 25 gives us. It may be that there is some other assumption of how levirate marriage works here. Okay. Okay. And then the final, halahen tesaberna, just a couple of quick things. Should you wait for them to grow up is, I think, a wonderfully rich allusion to the story of Tamar and Yehuda. Should you wait for them to grow up, right? Which is what Tamar is in theory doing, even though she knows very well that Yehuda will never give his third son to her. Zakovich makes a really interesting comment that halahen, because you would expect halahem tesaberna with a mem, which would be masculine, halahen, which is feminine. Zakovich takes that to be from the Aramaic lahen, which means for this reason. The Aramaic lahen is like the Hebrew lachen. So it would be like halachen tesaberna. Are you going to wait on account of this? And this incredibly small chance. It's interesting that the word for being kind of anchored is agenna, and historians of Jewish law kind of play around with the question of whether the later Mishnaic language of an aguna already exists here in this biblical text. And then the last thing before I stop for questions, marli ma'od mikem it's just a deliciously ambiguous Hebrew phrase, because it either means my situation is bitter on account of you, or my situation is bitterer than your situation, right? Marli mikem, I am bitter on your account, or marli mikem, I am more bitter than you are, right? And there's some way in which those two things might not be mutually exclusive. I'm not sure about that, but I think that that's worth thinking about, right? If she's saying I'm more bitter than you, just crudely, we've all lost husbands, but I've also lost my sons. I have lost more than you have, but also I'm terrified about your coming with me. I have nothing to offer you. If it's marli mikem, if you think that she still on some level harbors the suspicion that they died because they married these Moabite women, marli mikem could mean look at the bitterness I endure because of what you've caused. I'm not really persuaded that that's what's happening here, but it's not impossible in the Hebrew. Now, just very last thought, Yad Hashem Yatsa conjures up two passages in Eov, in Job 19 and Job 23, which are really interesting here. Does this in any way apply that she feels guilty? It seems to me that she does not think that she deserves her fate at all, and that's the best way to read this story. But I think it's just interesting. The allusion to Job here is suggestive. Suggestive of what exactly? I will leave it to I need more time to figure that out, but it is at minimum suggestive of something interesting. I think maybe of the possibility of her subtle protest of her situation. Okay, we have gotten through the first 13 verses. Tomorrow, in the first 15 minutes, we're going to go through, we're just going to skip over the most important verse in the book. It'll be great. Okay, questions. Morty or Leah, I don't know which one of you has some questions for me. I know some people need to drop off at 6. It's now 6:05. Feel free to do that, but I'll also try to take 10 minutes of questions.
Yeah, why don't we do this? Why don't we have folks, if you have a question, you can raise your hand, and Rav Shai can call on you, and we can ask you to unmute.
Okay, so I can't see everyone, but okay.
Or I can also call.
Why don't you do that, Morty, if that's okay with you?
Yeah, if you have a question, you can click on the reactions button at the bottom and click raise hand. Grace, I see you have your hand raised. Grace Flisser, is that a question? No. No problem. Judith.
Grace had her hand up to volunteer to read a long time ago. And the hand never disappeared for some reason.
You're up in just a moment.
Hi, Shai.
Hello.
Wonderful, as always, to learn with you. I just, on the subject of allusions or associations with Job, Louis Dubin's essay in Reading Ruth really delves into this question of Naomi.
It's not fresh to mind. It's not front of mind at all now. Say more.
Naomi as a female Job. That's the idea of God testifying against me. Anna Hashem bi.
Right.
That God has testified against me. It's precisely Job language. And so she wants to suggest that really it is a sense that I've been afflicted beyond any reasonable sense of justice, and that that she is going through that experience, which is the Job experience. And Aviva Zornberg wants to think of it as in the Kafka mode, which is certainly allied to Lois's perception as well.
Interesting. Morty, if it's not hassle for you, why don't we, can we just, because I'm not sure everyone knows the book we're talking about, why don't we have a little here, I'm marketing for my friends. Why don't we have a little, a link to the book Reading Ruth, edited by Judith Cates and Gail Reamer, I think, right? Am I right about that? Yeah. There's some really beautiful, beautiful stuff in that book. Other questions that people want to share? Who's doing the calling on people, Morty? You or me? I'm stunned by the silence. Oh yes, Donald Splansky. You look like you have your hand up.
Harvey has his hand up.
Yes, thank you. I want to ask.
Oh, first Donald, then Harvey. Yeah, go for it.
When it says Chesedim Hametim, is it possible? Maybe I'm influenced here by my teacher, Hanan Brichto, who wrote about keeping faith with people who are already dead by continuing to keep the faith of the Israelites on their own land. Is it possible that Naomi is already impressed with how her daughters-in-law are acting as if they were Jewish, as if they were Israelites, and therefore bringing felicity to their dead husbands in Sheol?
Yeah, so I so appreciate that you asked that as a, is it possible? Because then my answer is definitely yes. Is it possible? For sure, yes. I also wonder, Donald, if I could, whether there's something might even be even one step more simple to that is in line with Brichto, but is not quite the same, which is they're doing chesed to the dead by taking care of their mom. Right? Less than the sort of like eliciting felicity. It's like, we died, we left our mother with nothing. Remember, a society in which a woman has no sons and no husband, she's totally vulnerable to destitution and exploitation. So the chesed that they do with their spouses may be, right, simply protecting their otherwise defenseless mother. So I'm not sure that's exclusive with what you're saying. They may go together, but I would add that to the mix as well.
Thank you.
Great. I'm going to call on Harvey and then Grace.
Thanks, Rav Shai. This is always very stimulating. In the heart of Torah, and when you describe in Parshat Naso, you talk about the priestly blessing, and you describe it as that people have to be ready to receive the blessing. In verse 9, when Naomi asks God to grant them this menucha with a husband, do you see something similar in that Ruth was not ready then and would be ready, Orpah was not ready at all, and how would you compare some of your thoughts with the priestly blessing to what Ruth is, what Naomi is asking or granting to Ruth and Orpah?
So you always have to love a man who has deep learning in the heart of Torah. I have to really just express appreciation for that. Thank you. I think, Harvey, that I would be inclined to read this as to invert the way you set this up. I think the character in this story who has trouble receiving blessing is Naomi, who is so desolated as a person that she cannot really receive the love of her daughters-in-law. And then it takes Ruth's sheer stubbornness in demonstrating love to kind of pierce Naomi's defenses. I'm not sure this is about Ruth and Orpah. This is really about Naomi, who is not able to receive. It's like the narrator, she says she came home. This is at the end of chapter 1. She'll say, I came empty-handed. Then the narrator will say, oh, by the way, Ruth was standing there. Right? It's quite devastating in a way. right? She cannot see what's in front of her. And I don't think as like, Fuel and Gunn and these other Bible scholars, like they just kind of like, oh, this is the Naomi's character flaw. It's not Naomi's character flaw. This is like a person who's lost everything. And it's like, there's no, I mean, you can't see my posture. I'm like, imagine like walking through the world like this because you've been wounded so much. And until she can kind of open her hands a little bit to receive what she's being offered, it takes a while. So I would read it quite I would just invert what you were doing there. I think you called on grace, Morty, correct?
This was wonderful. Thank you for this. Earlier, you mentioned that Naomi was so alienated from God in this passage. I guess you were anticipating later in, when we got up to verse 13 or 12 or whatever it was, where it said, things are much more bitter for me than, whatever the translation may be, than it is for you or because of you. But anyway, to my mind, as a naive reader of this first chapter, I don't see proof that until verse 12 or 13 that she's alienated from God. So maybe you were anticipating just, later in the chapter where we see that she says she's bitter and that her life has been made bitter. So I just wanted to ask you, is there evidence in the text until that, I should say, is there evidence in the text before that sentence that she's alienated from God that you see?
So no. So thank you for that question, because I think it allows me to clarify what I was doing methodologically, whether or not it's totally defensible or not, which is that it's part of the same speech. Meaning in the same speech, more or less, that she says, go back, right? May God, you should go. May God bless you. It's in that same speech that she then will say, the hand of God has gone out against me. So it just strikes me as almost that I was reading them as simultaneous, rather than, oh, let's read verse 9 and then let's read verse 12 or whatever. I may have gotten those numbers wrong, but you got my point. I may be wrong about that, but that was my assumption, is that given what the comments in verse 13, Kiatz Aviyat Hashem, perhaps restricts what she might have meant or not meant in verse 9, since they're part of the same long appreciation, long expression of her feelings about her situation. I'm not convinced that I'm totally right about that, but that was my kind of methodological assumption. I think we should probably end, because it is 6:14 and a half, and I want to honor people's desire to either have dinner or go back to work, or the one or two of you in Australia, get your day started. Thank you all. I look forward to seeing many of you tomorrow.
Take care, everyone.
Morty, if you can, save the comments, okay? Thank you.